and development of the American literature stretches across generations and over 4 centuries. The timeline is divided into 5 periods, each possessing distinct characteristics, notable authors, and representative works. The colonial and early national period, 17th century to 1830. As early as 1600, the first European settler of North America wrote about their experiences starting. This was considered the earliest American literature and was characterized as practical, straightforward, often derived of Great Britain literature and future-centered. Moreover, the American literature consisted most of practical non-fiction written by British settlers who occupied the continent that was discovered by Christopher Columbus, which would later on become the United States of America. The period was marked by the following writers and their literary contributions. John Smith wrote the Histories of Virginia, published in 1608 and 1624. This account was written based on his life experiences as an English explorer and president of the Jamestown colony. The second one was writers Nathaniel Ward and John Windrow, wrote about the books on religions, which focused about the colonial America.
I am Anne Bradstreet. I wrote The 10th Muse Lately Sprung Up in America, which was said to be the earliest collection of poetry written in and about America, although it was published in England. A new era began when the United States declared its independence in 1776, and much new writing addressed the country's future. American poetry and fiction were largely modeled on what was being published overseas in Great Britain, and much of what American readers consumed also came from Great Britain. Between 1787 and 1788, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers, which greatly influenced the political direction of the United States. Between 1770s and 1780s, Benjamin Franklin wrote autobiography which showed his American life story. Phyllis Whitley, an African woman enslaved in Boston, wrote the first African-American book entitled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral in 1773. Philip Freneau was another notable poet in the era.
Autobiography of Oloda Equanos, The Interesting Narrative 1789, was among the earliest slave narratives and a forceful argument of abolition. By the first decades of 19th century, a truly American literature began to emerge, though still derived from British literary tradition. The short stories and novels, published from 1800s and 1820s, began to depict American science, society, and explore the Americans' landscape in an unprecedented manner. Washington Irving published a collection of short stories and essays, The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, in year 1819 to 20. It includes The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, the two of the earliest American short stories. James Fenimore Cooper wrote novels of adventure of the frontierman Natty Bumppo. These novels, called the Leather Stocking Tales, year 1823 to 41, depict the experience in the American wilderness in both realistic and highly romanticized ways.
Romanticism is a way of thinking that emphasizes and embraces individualism and the person's emotional experience over a reason. This is also a movement that shows appreciation of the wildness of nature over human-made order. A worldwide view which emerged in the Western Europe in the late 18th century, the Americans embraced the movement in the early 19th century. Hello, my name is Edgar Allan Poe. I'm one of the well-known writers during the Romantic period. I was a genius who was often fermented and struggled against writing conventions during the 1830s and up to my mysterious death in 1849. My poem, The Raven, is a gloomy depiction of lost love. Its eeriness is intensified by its meter and rhyme scheme. The short story is titled The Fall of the House of Usher and The Cast of Amontillado are gripping tales of horror. In New England, several different groups of writers and thinkers emerged after 1830, each exploring the experience of individuals in different segments of American society. James Russell Lowell was among those who used humor and dialect in verse and prose to depict everyday life in the Northeast. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Oliver Wendell Holmes were the most prominent of the upper-class Brahmins who filtered their depictions of American through European models and sensibilities.
The Transcendentalists developed an elaborate philosophy that saw in all of creation a unified whole. Transcendentalist concepts include 1. Nature is the truth, 2. Nature is God and God is nature, and 3. Be self-reliant and stand up for what you believe. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote influential essays, while Henry David Thoreau wrote Walden, year 1854, an account of his life alone by Walden Pond. Margaret Fuller was editor of The Diet, an important transcendentalist magazine. The three men writers, namely Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Walt Whitman, wrote and published literary works that became some of the most enduring and well-known works of American literature up to the present day. As a young man, Nathaniel Hawthorne published short stories, most notable among them the allegorical Young Goodman Brown, year 1835. In the 1840s, he crossed paths with the Transcendentalists before he started writing his two most significant novels, The Scarlet Letter, year 1850, and The House of Seven Gables, year 1851. Herman Melville was one of Hawthorne's friends and neighbors. Hawthorne was also a strong influence on Melville's Moby Dick, year 1851, which was the culmination of Melville's early life of traveling and writing.
Walt Whitman wrote poetry that describes his home, New York City. He refused the traditional constraints of rhyme and meter in favor of the free verse in Leaves of Grass in 1855, and his frankness in subject matter and tone repelled in some critics. But the book, which went through many subsequent editions, became a landmark in American poetry, and it epitomized the ethos of the Romantic period. William Wells Brown published what is considered the first Black American novel, Clotel, in 1853. He also wrote the first African American play to be published, The Escape, in 1858. In 1859, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Harriet E. Wilson became the first Black women to publish fiction in the United States. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin first published serially in 1851-52, and it's credited with raising opposition in the North to slavery. I'm Emily Dickinson. I live a life quite unlike other writers of Romantic period. I live largely in seclusion. Only a handful of her poems were published before my death in 1886, and I was a woman working at a time when men dominated the literary scene. Yet, her poems express a romantic vision as clearly as Walt Whitman or Edgar Allan Poe's. They are sharp-edged and emotionally intense. 5 of my notable poems are I'm Nobody, Who Are You? Because I could not stop for death, my life had stood a loaded gun. A bird came down the walk, safe in their alabaster chambers.
The Civil War in the United States caused an immense human cost. They said was had reported that more than 2.3 million soldiers fought in the war. As a result of it, an estimated number of 151,000 people died in the 1861 to 1865. Walt Whitman claimed that a great literature will arise out of the era of those 4 years. Realism became the literary movement of the most writers. The literature had emerged in the following decades was characterized by its detailed, realistic, and vision of the world as it truly was. After the Civil War, writing has become the means of self-expression of the Americans. Following are the well-known American writers who were known from this period up to the present time. Hello everyone, I am Samuel Clemens with my pen name Mark Twain. I am typesetter, a journalist, a riverboat captain, a laborer before I became a 27-year-old writer in 1863. Published in 1865, I celebrated a short story, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras Country, that makes myself famous. My story was humorous tale. At the same time, its characters were realistic depictions of American people. I deployed this writing style marked with humor and realism in my writing. Some of my notable works include novels The Adventure of Tom Sawyer in 1876 and The Adventure of Huckleberry Finn 1885. I also wrote the travel narratives The Innocents Abroad in 1869 and Life on the Mississippi in 1883. Lastly, I wrote the short stories about Jim Baker's Gin Barn in 1880 and The Man That Corrupted Hadley Burge in 1899.
Meanwhile, naturalism is also a literary movement that emerged during the period, but this was distinctly marked with an intensified form of realism. This movement had drawn inspiration from 19th century French who sought to document, through fiction, the reality that they saw around them and particularly centered on the middle class and working class who were living in cities. The foremost among American writers who embraced naturalism was Theodore Dreiser. His Sister Carrie, 1900, is the most important American naturalist novel. Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, 1893, and The Red Badge of Courage, 1895, by Stephen Crane, and Max Tighe, 1899, The Octopus, 1901, and The Pit, 1903, by Frank Norris are novels that vividly depict the reality of urban life, war, and capitalism. Paul Laurence Dunbar was an African-American writer who wrote poetry in black dialect. Possum, When the Constance Hat, that were popular with his white audience and gave them what they believed was reality for black Americans. Dunbar also wrote poems not in dialect. We Were the Masked Sympathy, that exposed the reality of racism in America during Reconstruction and afterwards. Henry James had the same views with the realist and naturalist, but his writing style and use of literary form created an aesthetic experience aside from merely documenting the truth. He was preoccupied with the clash in values between the United States and Europe. His writing shows features of both 19th century realism and naturalism, and 20th century modernism. Some of his notable novels are The American 1877, The Portrait of a Lady 1881, What May See You 1897, The Wings of the Dove 1902, The Golden Bowl 1904.
The modernist period, 1910 to 1945, advances in science and technology in Western countries rapidly intensified at the first 20th century. The devastation of World War I and the Great Depression also caused widespread suffering in Europe and United States. A sense of disillusionment and loss pervades much American modernist fiction. The sense may center in specific individual or it may directed towards American society and towards civilization generally. It may generate a nihilistic, destructive impulse or it may express hope and the prospect of change. F. Scott Fitzgerald screwed the American thing in The Great Gatsby 1925. Richard Wright exposed and attacked American racism in Native Son, 1940. Ernest Hemingway's novels, The Sun Also Rises, 1926, and A Farewell to Arms, 1929. He articulated the disillusionment of the lost generation.
Cutter told hopeful stories of the American frontier, set mostly on the Great Plains in O Pioneers, 1913, and Ma Antonia, 1918. William Faulkner used his stream of consciousness technique in writing monologues and other formal techniques to break from past literary practice in The Sound and the Fury, 1929. In his literary works of Mice and Men, 1937, and The Grace of Wrath, 1939, John Steinbeck depicted the realistically difficult lives of migrant workers who belonged to the working class. T.S. Eliot was an American by birth and as of 1927, a British subject by choice. His fragmentary multi-voice, The Wasteland, 1922, is the quintessential modernist poem, but he was not the dominant voice among American modernist poets. Robert Frost and Carl Sandburg evocatively describe the regions, New England and the Midwest respectively, in which they live. The Harlem Renaissance produced a rich coterie of poets among the Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, and Claude McKay, and Alice Dunbar Nelson. Harriet Monroe founded Poetry Magazine in Chicago in 1912 and made it the most important organ for poetry and not just in the United States but for the English-speaking world. During the 1920s, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Marianne Moore, and E. E. Cummings expressed a spirit of revolution and experimentation in their poetry.
I am Zora Neale Hurston. I wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, which told the story of a black woman's 3 marriages. Drama came to prominence for the first time in the United States in the 20th century. Playwrights drew inspiration from European theater, but created plays that were uniquely and enduringly American. Eugene O'Neill was the foremost American playwright of the period. His Long Day's Journey into Night, written 1939 to 41, performed 1956, was the high point of more than 20 years of creativity that began in 1920 with Beyond the Horizon and concluded with The Iceman Comet, written 1939, performed 1946. During the 1930s, Lillian Hellman, Clifford Odets, and Langston Hughes wrote plays that exposed injustice in America. In his writings, Thornton Wilder presented an influential and realistic vision of small-town America in Our Town, first produced in 1938.
The United States, which emerged from the World War II confident and economically strong, entered the Cold War in the late 1940s. This conflict with the Soviet Union shaped global politics for more than 4 decades, and the proxy war and threat of the nuclear annihilation that came to define it were just some of influence shaping American literature during the second half of the 20th century. The 1950 and 60 brought significant culture shift within the United States driven by civil rights movement and the women's movement prior to the last decades of 20th century. American literature was largest and story of dead white men who had created art and living white men doing the same. By the turn of 21st century, American literature had become a much more complex and inclusive story grounded on the wide-ranging body of past writing produced in the United States by people of different backgrounds and open to American and present day.
Gwendolyn Brooks became in 1950 the first African American poet to win a Pulitzer Prize. The Black art movement was grounded in the tenets of Black nationalism and sought to generate a uniquely Black consciousness. The autobiography of Malcolm X in 1965 by Malcolm X and Alex Haley is among its most lasting literary expression. Toni Morrison's first novel, The Bluest Eye, in 1970, launched a writing career that would put the lives of Black women at its center. She received a Nobel Prize in 1993. In 1960s, Alice Walker began writing novels, poetry, and short stories that reflected their involvement in the civil rights movement.
Having a lasting influence on American poetry during this period, the Beat movement had been a short-lived movement in the history of evolution and development American literature. Allen Ginsberg wrote Hole in 1956, a poem that pushed aside the formal, largely traditional poetic conventions that had come to dominate American poetry. Raucous, profane, and deeply moving. Hole reset Americans' expectations for poetry during the second half of the 20th century and beyond. Among the important poets of this period are Adrienne Rich, Anne Sexton, Donald Hall, Elizabeth Bishop, James Merrill, John Berryman, Nikki Giovanni, Rita Doe, Robert Pinsky, Sylvia Plath, Tracy K. Smith, W.S. Merwin, Yusef Komunyakaa. In the early decades of the contemporary period, American drama was dominated by three men, namely Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams, and Edward A.J.B.
This is the other notable American dramatist in post-modernism and contemporary period in 1945. Amory Baraka, August Wilson, David Henry Wang, David Mamet, and Tosaki Shange, Richard Greenberg, Sam Shepard, Susan Laurie Park, Tony Kushner, Wendy Wasserstein.
Here are the top 5 greatest American novels. List of some of the best American novels from classic writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne to more modern names like Stephen King, with room for the list to grow. The American novels can represent the spirit of the age in the United States during the time it was written or the time it was set in. And so, here's our countdown for the greatest American novels. Top number 5. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Top number 4. The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Top number 3. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Top number 2. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. And at top number 1, the most and greatest American novels in our rankers is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. These are the additional American novels you really need to read. The Slaughterhouse Five by Kurt Vonnegut in 1969. Is of Eden by John Steinbeck in September 1952. Moby Dick or the Whale by Herman Melville. It was published on October 10, 1851. Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. It was published in 1868. And last, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, first published in 1953.
The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Two roads diverge in a yellow wood. And sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler, long as I stood, and looked down, one as far as I could. There where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had warned them, really about the same. And both that morning equally lame, and lips no step had trodden black. Oh, I keep the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on the way, I doubted If I should ever come back, I shall be telling this with a sigh. Some were ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all difference.
A Noiseless Patient Spider by Walt Whitman. A noiseless patient spider, I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unwilling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached in measureless ocean of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need to be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul.